The red gloom had long hung over the country. The sense of impending doom had spread from community to community, from church to city hall, from the humble laborers to the masters of industry, from city to state, from mother to her children, from family doctor to the once great centers of care and compassion. Now even the halls of justice had grown silent. The family farms of the nation lay abandoned, the livestock killed and buried in great pits, the main streets of every town disfigured by countless boarded-up shops and empty playgrounds. The deliberations of the legislature were sparsely attended, as the business of government had long ago passed on to the experts, and the whole emergence, spread, and progress of the great despair gripping the nation had been the incidents of a single generation. The new unelected Prime Minister, Mark Prospero, was the latest in a long line of rulers who had masterminded the contagion, a key component of which was the constitutional reform entrenched some 30 years earlier that remained the source of much pride among the people. The centerpiece of the reform was the Declaration of Fundamental Human Rights and Freedoms. Every leader since had assured the people ad nauseum that despite the loss of manufacturing jobs, the closure of family farms, the replacement of skilled work with service jobs, the steady decline in the standard of living, and the obliteration of culture and traditions, they were all better off because, unlike some horrible places in the world, run by scary dictators, they had their fundamental rights. No matter how stark the reality of their dismal lives, and the even darker future faced by their 1.5 children, the people never faltered in their faith in the Constitution. Thanks mostly to the talented band of illusionists that made the grand deception work like a charm, Prospero was happy, dauntless, and sagacious. Now that the ranks of the unemployed had doubled yet again, with many of their number wandering aimlessly across the land, mere shadows of men, if not otherwise occupied by video games and drugs, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the global elite, and with this jolly band retired to the deep seclusion of one of his many gated communities. His residence was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of Prospero's eccentric yet august tastes. The residence had been amply provisioned before the recent economic downturn, brought on by the full imposition of the global sustainable development objectives. The iron gates would keep out the riffraff during this round of deliberations. The mood was gay. Prospero and his guests bid defiance to the contagion sweeping the land. Their lifestyles were secure. Their private jets lay waiting. In the meantime, Mark had provided for all the appliances of pleasure. The sedated masses wouldn't awaken any time soon, if ever. Now it was time to open the ball. The 4 central characters in Prospero's masquerade were well known. The first among them were the rich aesthetes, whose interest lay solely in fending off any kind of boredom, so characteristic of modern leisure. The aesthetes' great gift to the nation was in contriving behavior in others that was responsive to their wishes and fed their sated appetites. The aesthetes were always accompanied by their buffoons, improvisatore, and ballet dancers. Following close behind these were the therapists, the next of the 4 central characters in the grand, largely fake drama, which is the modern state. The therapist prescribed care, as if it rolled off an assembly line, with sound technique and effectiveness. It was the therapist who transformed neurotic symptoms into directed energy, maladjusted individuals into well-behaved, well-adjusted ones. The ends were a given, and a therapist never engaged in moral debate. Truth was displaced as a value and replaced with the most up-to-date psychological therapies and pharmaceuticals. The third character to enter the masquerade were the managers, whose central responsibility was to direct and redirect their departments and corporations' available resources, both human and non-human, as effectively as possible. The manager was the master of controlling behavior and suppressing conflict. His ends did not need justification. His concerns, as with the therapist, was with technique, transforming people and things into a finished product. The managers didn't know it, but their effectiveness was in reality a masquerade, all of its own, a masquerade of social control. They had come to the right place. Finally, the 4th character entered the ball. These were legion, all masked, in great columns moving in perfect synchronicity. The other characters and guests bowed at their arrival, for these were the experts, but not just any experts. These pillars of society possessed the sacred knowledge, the managerial and bureaucratic expertise. These were the greatest magicians, illusionists, and wizards of them all, for only they knew that such expertise was a mere moral fiction, since the kind of knowledge which would be required to sustain it did not exist. Like the clergyman lucky enough to pray for rain just before the unpredicted end of a drought, these experts could always rely on their managerial expertise producing unsystematic effects that did often enough coincide with the promised results, even though these results were always entirely coincidental. Mark Prospero was delighted. With the ball ended, and the worst of the contagion burnt out, and after all the wine was guzzled and all the chicken and cream sauce devoured, he would order the iron gates open once again, so that his masters of illusion could once more work their magic. These were the great traders in moral fictions, most notably in the fiction of the utility of the state's good works, and above all in the fiction of the fundamental rights that kept people content and the modern state afloat. This concludes the Masque of the Modern State, based on chapters 3 and 6 of Alistair MacIntyre's classic After Virtue, with a tip of the hat, of course, to Edgar Allan Poe. Although not directed specifically at legal universalism or so-called fundamental rights, MacIntyre's analysis of how these four characters, or as I would call them perhaps archetypes, are used in the modern post-Enlightenment state to conceal beliefs that are in fact pure fiction, is entirely on point here. It takes all that the liberal aesthetes, therapists, managers, and experts can muster to make us believe these rights actually exist, and the modern state is rational. It has to be one of the most brilliant feats of magic ever devised to convince themselves, as well as the people, that the positive laws of our legislatures and the decisions of our judges, both organs of the state, could be controlled or restrained by mere words, these written in high-minded language in documents called constitutions, bills of rights, charters, or declarations of the rights of man. The truth, as demonstrated by the emergence of the total state throughout the West, is that these words not only fail to control the state, they are themselves tools of authoritarianism. Take Ireland, which without a written constitution preserved for centuries Ireland's fundamental character as a Catholic nation, including an absolute unquestionable ban on abortion. Check out my video on this in relation to Irish writer John Waters and his take on natural law. What happened then when Ireland took those unwritten laws and put them in a written constitution? They turned them into man-made laws, and man-made laws can be repealed. They were, and those inalienable rights are no more. The notion of overarching fundamental rights is of course nonsense. To be clear, these rights have often been mixed up with pre-Enlightenment notions of natural law, as reflected in the writings of Cicero or Thomas Aquinas. They are totally different, as I will explain in a future video. As MacIntyre explains, rights have to be rooted in community. Backstopping an imaginary international world order doesn't change the fact that the world still is made up of communities, people, nationalities, some of which are states. Universalism, on an international scale, presupposes something that does not exist, a single, homogeneous humanity. Humanity is a bit more complicated than that. Rights, says MacIntyre, presuppose the existence of a socially established set of rules. Such rules only come into existence at particular historical periods under particular social circumstances. They are in no way universal features of the human condition. It turns out, before the Enlightenment, or even the late Middle Ages, coming into the world came with a welcome package that I call the law. These laws you didn't ask for came from your people, or community, or nation, and gave you not only your rights, but also your purpose, or telos. Law and morality were united. In fact, ancient Greek and Roman languages didn't even have a word for morality, and the idea of human rights, in quotes, as we understand the word today, didn't exist in any culture until around 1400. So how fundamental were they? MacIntyre looks to Aristotle to describe a world very different from our own, the world of modernity. Aristotle is probably just one of many who could have described the old order and how people functioned within it. In his Ethics, Aristotle tells us about a time when man started off as he happens to be, in quotes, but was able to realize his essential nature, again in quotes, through ethics. Life had a purpose, but you would have to work at it. With diligence, you might discover that essential nature if you lived a good ethical life. MacIntyre writes that Christianity didn't change this in a fundamental way, but added the purpose of the next life, a metaphysical purpose, and some new Christian virtues to get there. The key here is that we are entitled to an inherited law and a life with a purpose. Enter the Enlightenment, and all this changes. Man is suddenly without a purpose. He is an autonomous moral being. He is to live a lonely, isolated, individualistic life. What the Enlightenment calls freedom, I would argue, represents a destruction of our birthright, those laws and customs and traditions that gave life a purpose. Now you're on your own. You're naked in the world, an easy prey, and there are plenty of predators. How many have added themselves to the long list of people who counted on the rule of law, or their fundamental rights, to save them, and were grievously disappointed to realize both are fickle, if not outright fictions. The best reason for asserting so bluntly that there are no such rights is indeed of precisely the same type as the best reason which we possess for asserting that there are no witches, and the best reason which we possess for asserting that there are no unicorns. Every attempt to give good reasons for believing that there are such rights has failed. But why persist in believing in human rights? One explanation is that they are fiction that props up another fiction. The concept of rights was generated to serve one set of purposes as part of the social invention of the autonomous moral agent. It is no coincidence that the first law struck down after Canada got its Charter of Rights in 1982 was a law that gave workers a guaranteed day off on Sunday. The problem was, this was a Christian day of rest. Can't have that. Now, and ever since, not only is Christianity continually the target of those who love their human rights, workers can work their 2 or 3 jobs 7 days a week. Intermediary institutions that come between the state and the atomized individual are frequent targets of those lovers of human rights. The great philosophers inherited all these moral notions, like the importance of telling the truth, keeping your promises, the sanctity of marriage. But now, according to MacIntyre, these all had to be justified. The philosophers tried in turn. David Hume tried the passions. Kant's universal law tried to justify morals based on reason. Kierkegaard as choice. According to MacIntyre, they all failed. Much like legal philosophy, Enlightenment thinking is trapped in its universality, that there is one morality inherited by all, presumably rational human beings, and that somehow this translates into a grand scheme of human laws and moral principles. That is a tall order. It is also plainly false. Anyone with eyes can see that the world is full of people living under different legal and moral systems, all lumped together in so-called nation-states. Legal universalism means more than human rights and one global legal regime. It also applies to the universal application of laws within a nation-state. These states are treated as containers into which you can pour all manner of humanity, and apparently by some magic, they are all suddenly subject to the same laws, the positive laws of that state. This is also sheer nonsense. In Canada, it is illegal to carry a sidearm, including a knife. The Sikh community argued that it had the right to carry a ceremonial dagger, called the kirpan, as it was in the practice of their religion. The Supreme Court of Canada, of course, agreed, declaring carrying a knife, for some, is a matter of religious freedom. Really, religious freedom. I'll put it to you that this had nothing to do with fundamental rights. Rather, the modern state must continually recognize that different people are subject to different laws for entirely non-legal reasons. In this case, Sikhs, a well-represented people in Canada and in communities sufficiently large to support distinct systems of rules, had their separate laws affirmed. Following a familiar pattern, some Canadian laws they accept, some they don't. In this case, they didn't. We see here how so-called fundamental rights are actually used to conceal or mask the fact multicultural states have become multi-legal states. It's unavoidable and challenges in a fundamental way the notion that the state is the sole source of law. Fact is, it isn't, and it's getting harder to hide. What then are the true sources of law? Well, what better place to look than the learned law societies, regulators of the legal community in our various states and provinces? Well, aren't these fully occupied bastions of modernism and progressivism? Of course, but in the interest of equity, diversity, and inclusion, they have taken the remarkable step of effectively undermining the authority of the modern state they so fervently support, at least for some. A great example is the recognition of the multiple sources of native and aboriginal rights and laws. The law societies have prescribed and indeed made mandatory its study as a requirement for lawyers to maintain their license. These are amazing documents, and indeed the implications of these publications cast serious doubt on the state's purported monopoly on the law. All laws flow from a place, or multiple places of authority, including laws within indigenous legal traditions. The underpinnings or sources of indigenous law are entwined with the social, historical, political, biological, economic, and spiritual circumstances of different indigenous peoples and communities. As John Burroughs emphasizes, that Canada could be characterized as a juridically pluralistic state because it draws on many sources of law to sustain order. Burroughs identifies 5 sources of Indigenous law. These sources are not separate, nor do they operate in silos, as Indigenous legal traditions usually involve the interaction of 2 or more sources. In fact, in practice, it would be hard to separate them from one another. The 5 sources are sacred teachings, naturalistic observations, positivistic proclamations, deliberative practices, and local and national customs. First, sacred law. Most legal traditions in the world, including Canadian law, draw upon religion, see preamble to its constitution. While there is no doubt that the sacred is a source of Indigenous law, not all Indigenous law should be characterized as sacred. This is an important distinction, as laws that are considered sacred are often viewed as being unassailable or unchangeable. An inherent danger of such a perspective is that it reduces human beings to legal actors who are merely following rules, rather than fostering and normalizing legal actors who are responsible for interpreting, debating, reasoning through, and applying the law. The second source of law, natural law, refers to law that is drawn from the observations of the natural world, including analogies and legal reasoning drawn from how animals and other non-human life interact with one another. The third source of law, deliberative law, is formed through processes of persuasion, deliberation, counsel, and discussion. Burroughs refers to the debating, interpreting, and talking that people do as the proximate source of law, as opposed to natural or sacred sources that may form the backdrop to those discussions. The fourth source of Indigenous law is positivistic law. Positivistic law includes the proclamations, rules, regulations, codes, teachings, and axioms that people understand as governing or binding their behavior. A fifth source of law that Burroughs identifies is customary law, which refers to the practices developed through repetitive patterns of social interaction that are accepted as binding on those who participate in them. Social interaction is another source of law. Social interaction means the collective ways in which people formalize law through their long-term social, economic, and political interactions within their own societies and with people in other societies. Alan Hanna identifies relationality as a source of Indigenous law, meaning the ways in which Indigenous legal institutions such as kinship or family structures regulate and maintain interactions with others, human and non-human, and the kinds of behavior that people can expect and rely upon from others. What is important here is the recognition that the source of law is much more than what the state decides. If the sources of law for one branch of humanity includes the social, historical, political, biological, economic, and spiritual, well then surely, since we're all human, this must be true for all self-identifiable ethnicities, people, and cultures, so long as they are lucky enough to have conserved their heritage and are prepared to make some attempt to practice it. There is no reason this should not be true, for example, of many Europeans, Asians, or other peoples coexisting in our multicultural states. The outrage felt by one population or another at yet another grasping piece of legislation from state or federal governments may well be rooted in far more than personal preference, religion, or political views. Rather, this outrage may be rooted in the experience of real conflict between laws that still attach to people, those inherited as a birthright, and other competing sources of law, such as the state. It has long been looked upon as a mere historical curiosity that after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Germanic tribes that settled in the lands of the former empire lived under their own laws and customs, which entailed a return to the ancient principle of, in quotes, personality of law, close quotes, in which the law applicable to a person was determined not by the territory they happened to live in, but by the people, the national group to which they belonged. Perhaps we are witnessing a return to the personality of law, or rather, it was always there and never left us. The interesting question then is whether there is a surviving customary traditional law for the rest of us that has survived modernity in our busy legislatures. Have these ancient laws really been repealed, as many modern lawyers and judges would insist, or have they survived, waiting to be released back into the legal system and enforced? Is the flow of humanity across the globe reviving a personality of law? Good questions, and ones I will return to on this channel, so stay tuned, like and subscribe, please. Francesco Belvisi writes that the plurality of law in the world is an inevitable consequence of our times. The close link between law and culture is a well-established fact in modern legal thought. In the years to come, increased migration will erode not only national characteristics, but also European Western features. In a pluralist society which boasts a polytheism of values, one can no longer assume the absolute superiority of one's own principles over those of others. At stake here is the possibility of living together in peace in a global society characterized by conflicting legal systems. Obviously, in my view, the notion of a global society is a dubious proposition. But rather than relying on the legal fiction of fundamental human rights, looking to other sources of law, perhaps ancient ones, that attach to people, may represent a far more reliable, lasting way of resisting the overreach of the cultureless, value-free modern state.